So I'm going to just begin with introductions. I guess that will definitely get worked out, but we have two guests who are going to be speaking with us this afternoon, Sheila Waters and Julian Waters. As you may have guessed from the previous DVD that you watched, the previous film was featuring the work in the Florence flood recovery, the work of Peter Waters. Peter is Sheila's late husband and Julian's father, so that's the connection. But I want to tell you a little bit about the two of them because these two are actually pretty distinguished individuals in their own right. Sheila Waters is an internationally renowned calligraphic artist and an instructor whose career has been devoted to calligraphic commissions for royalty, museums, libraries, corporations, and distinguished publishers. And also, she's produced her own artwork for collectors for nearly 70 years. Her best-known works include the Roundel of the Seasons, which is an extraordinary calligraphic work, I have to say. She's holding it up. It's unbelievable. It is unbelievable. And also the illuminated manuscript of Dylan Thomas's play Under Milkwood. Sheila earned her master's degree at the Royal College of Art, and she is a fellow of the Society of Scribes and Illuminators. She published a classic textbook called Foundations of Calligraphy in 2006, and it was reprinted in 2008, and it was reprinted again in 2014. Her own work was the subject of a retrospective in 2009 at the Strathmore Hall Arts Center in Bethesda, Maryland, where she celebrated her 80th. She's holding that up too. There we are. We didn't plan this, but there it is. Okay. So at that retrospective, Sheila celebrated her 80th birthday, and that work in that show in 2009 was accompanied by the publication Sheila Waters at 80, a retrospective. Quite extraordinary. Then on to Julian. Julian is an internationally renowned lettering designer. He studied and taught with Hermann Zapf and then succeeded him in teaching lettering design at the Rochester Institute of Technology. He was actually asked by Hermann to succeed him. Julian has held residencies and offered lectures and instruction at the Sidwell Friends School, the Corcoran School of Art, both in Washington, D.C., the Cooper Union in New York, Wells College, and he's also offered lettering workshops in Canada, the U.S., all through Europe, the U.K., Australia, Hong Kong, and Japan. His own original typefaces that he designed include Adobe Waters Tilting Pro and T.H. Jefferson produced for Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. Quite extraordinary. As I mentioned, so let's give Julian a hand. So as I just mentioned to you, Sheila's late husband and Julian's father was the inimitable Peter Waters. If you don't know this, Peter was the first Chief of Conservation at the Library of Congress, where he started in 1971. Before moving to the U.S., Peter was the technical director of the restoration system for the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze in Florence. Peter led the British team during the 10 months immediately following the Florence flood. Mass treatments for the 110,000 damaged books of the Great Palatina and Magliabechiana collections were devised under his careful watch, and this laid a foundation for the development of the profession of library conservation. I have to say, the conservators in the room and myself, watching that last DVD, was thinking, they have taught us so much. We have learned so much that we still do today based on that work. So this talk is a distillation of detailed information about the achievements and impact of those early months in Florence. It's described in a book that Sheila has authored and Julian has co-designed, and the book is entitled Waters Rising, Letters from Florence. It was just published by the Legacy Press in April 2016. We have a limited number of copies. Yep. You can give that a round of applause too. We have a limited number of copies of that book for sale at our reception, and Sheila has graciously, and I guess Julian as well, have graciously offered to sign those, autograph those copies for you. The book contains over 100 letters exchanged between Sheila in England and Peter in Florence, while Sheila was serving as a liaison between Peter, the British Fund, and all of the bookbinders and specialists going back and forth to help. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our distinguished guests. Thank you.
Well, it's lovely to be here and see so many familiar faces of old friends I've known for years and who I haven't seen for years because I haven't been in LA for a long time. You're going to hear some repetition because Ellen has pinched quite a bit before we're going to say. So we're not going to get thrown by that, so we'll just repeat, because we have to read it, there's so much detail in it, it's not a thing you can do off the cuff. We got the pictures up there, right. We've just put one piece of each of ours, just as a reminder for people who don't know us, just a piece of our work based around the seasons, and this is a print, but it's the actual size. So just to give you an idea of the actual size of it. 1,000 hours of work in that back in 1981, but I would certainly never be working again in my life on anything as detailed as that. Let's see what I'm going to say here. Right. Anyway, in 2009, Julie and I produced a profusely illustrated retrospective about my life and work, and this year we finished working on the book Waters Rising, which we discussed today.
And yes, I'm Julian Waters, and these are a couple of things that I designed just recently. This was a special monograph I designed and wrote about the work and life of Hermann Zaff, who was my other teacher and a great friend for more than 35 years. And we have a copy of these here if you want to take a look afterwards, and even a flyer for more information about the Waters Rising book. Here is a little bit of the sort of calligraphy work that I do, which is very varied. And not stepping too much on Sheila's toes. We tend to have our own different specialties.
My late husband was the brilliant bookbinder and conservator Peter Waters, who died in 2003. This is largely his story and that of his team members, but also mine, as I played a small part in the restoration operations following the flood almost 50 years ago. In this talk, we will describe the setting up of the massive restoration system for the National Library of Florence, the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze, or BNCF for short, after the disastrous flood of November 4th, 1966. Incidentally, our middle son, Michael, his birthday is on November 4th. How ironic is that? He was 7. It's widely recognized that the vital and respected profession of book and paper conservation has its origins in the philosophy and treatments developed in the aftermath of the flood. Florence was in crisis immediately after the flood, and this is what the student mud angel volunteers had to face. I'll be up to here we are. Note the ghostly shapes where books had floated up to the ceiling by the filthy rising water before it receded. That was probably oily on the ceiling there. For the 50th anniversary of the Florence flood, we have produced an important book, Waters Rising, Letters from Florence, published this spring by Kathleen Baker of the Legacy Press. The title, by the way, was Julian's idea. Waters Rising, rather nice pun. In nearly 500 pages, our book contains all the letters Peter and I wrote to each other during the months following the flood. Peter's letters, almost 50 of them, were his chief diary, an authentic record I'm making public now after 50 years, and they're completely unexpurgated. Too much of a problem to try and see what I should cut out and what I should leave in. For easy reference, I extracted all the relevant technical information from his letters and notes, that's since he's died, by the way, for the narrative diary section. This means that conservators can cross-reference, they can read what actually happened on any given day and then see it written in full in the corresponding letter. The book has over 280 photos, mostly taken by Peter, of damaged books and treatments devised for them, but a section of some of Peter's bookbindings that he made before Florence are included, and that was the wish of our publisher, Kathleen Baker. I'm very grateful to Kathleen Baker for the huge amount of time she so enthusiastically gave to this project, and to Julian, of course, her co-designer, who's helped me greatly with ongoing critical feedback over the years and by organising the visuals for this talk. I could not have done it without him at all, and this is the 4th time this year. I'll tell you that later. We are also indebted to Randy Silverman for introducing us to Kathleen and for his masterful introduction about Peter's life, work and impact on the library field. He is in charge of preservation at the Marriott Library in the State University of Utah.
Waters Rising comes with a remastered DVD of the 40-minute film, The Restoration of Books, Florence, 1968, made by Roger Hill and Peter, which you just saw. And by the way, that's Peter doing the leather binding at the end, and Chris Clarkson making the Lindell binding. But we'll talk more about that later. Most of the images shown in this talk are in the book. In fact, this lecture is a kind of miniature version of the book. In the lecture, we use a lot of Peter's own words taken from his article in the 1969 edition of the Penrose Annual, an annual review of the graphic arts since 1895, because his descriptions of the fully developed sections of the restoration system are so succinct.
I have quoted the same article extracts in several previous overview talks. The first was in 2006 in New York University's 40th anniversary symposium, actually in Florence, and Julian came with me on that occasion. Those proceedings were published by Archetype Publications entitled Conservation Legacies of the Florence Flood of 1966, where you can find more technical information in the talks by Tony Keynes and Chris Clarkson. The second time was in the National Gallery of Art in Washington in 2011 for the 45th anniversary, and the Zeffirelli film was shown on both occasions. I've now seen that 5 times. And it's as moving now as it was then. I hope you all will enjoy, isn't quite the word, but impressed by it anyway. The third time was in May this year at the AIC conference in Montreal, where Julian joined me, reading all direct quotes from Peter. We presented it again on October 7th at the Brodia Club in New York. And 2 weeks ago, I gave this lecture again, without Julian this time, at the symposium at the University of Michigan on the actual dates of November 3rd and 4th of the 50th anniversary of the flood. Since Peter's death, Julian has been my closest colleague and advisor. As some of you know, well, no, we've already heard this about you. Leave that without. I'm a renowned designer and lettering typography. See, I told you we'd had quite a bit of talk.
So a little background. Peter Waters, on my father, Peter Waters. He was Chief of Conservation of the Library of Congress from 1971 to his retirement in 1995 as a direct result of his pioneering work in Florence. In Florence, he had been, see, this is also repetitive, but he'd been technical director of the setting up of the National Library's vast restoration system from the end of November 66 to October 1967. Sheila became directly involved herself and spent a total of 3 months working with Peter at the BNCF during 1967. My brother Michael and I were in Florence ourselves with Peter and Sheila that summer for 9 weeks at the age of 10 and 7, and the experience made a bigger impact on our lives.
Peter's work in England before he was 40 is not as well known as his time in the Library of Congress, so we'll do a little of his background to explain why he was chosen for such a leading role. He had no experience of dealing with damaged books on such a massive scale, but who had? He had a reputation, though, as an innovative designer, bookbinder and manuscript restorer in partnership with Roger Powell, who had restored and rebound the Book of Kells in 1953. The cockled leaves in the Book of Kells and of other manuscripts were flattened in the same way as shown here in the Icelandic saga Skardensis being worked on at the Powell Waters workshop. You also saw in that film, the Roger Hill film, Peter actually stretching that very dark vellum flyleaf with the same bulldog clips all the way around. Those were his hands doing that.
I have to say, I'm very fortunate to have grown up with this kind of work going on, and being able to watch Sheila doing calligraphy and map making as a little kid. So, I mean, you don't realize it when you're that young, but I do realize and really appreciate that, as I do being with her today, 50 years later, and she's still around, and she's still very, very alive and active. And so doing some of these things together, I think, is very meaningful and important. So I just had to put that out there. So Peter and Sheila met when they were master's degree students at the Royal College of Art, London, the RCA, in 1949. Peter specialized in fine bookbinding, drawn lettering and typography, and Sheila in calligraphy and lettering and typography. Roger Powell was their bookbinding tutor. And I also have to add, she won't like this maybe, but that she was equally as bad at bookbinding as Peter was as bad at calligraphy. So you know, they kind of put their strengths together as each stopped doing that.
I gave it up. Well, he gave up calligraphy too.
But he was pretty phenomenal at drawn lettering, typography.
Amazing, yeah, before I even met him.
Peter previously spent 5 years from age 14 studying bookbinding with William Matthews, who was also Roger Powell's teacher at Guildford College of Art. Here are 3 of the bindings that he made at Guildford as a teenager. This is the very first one, right?
No, that's not the first one.
It's a very early one.
But that was probably when he was about 15, 16.
Here, Peter's teacher Matthews did one side of the binding, and Peter did the other, but no one knows which was which. And he was what?
Yeah,
16,
17, maybe 17 to 18. Right.
Maybe you'd like to
Right.
share a little story.
A little ad lib here. Why did Peter do bookbinding at all? Well, at 14, he went along to bookbinding class with a friend of his to make portfolios. And on that very first day, he knocked over the glue pot of hot, that horrible viscous dark brown glue, Tide glue that they used to use, and he knocked it over all over the floor. And he was very shy at the time. Of course, he spent the rest of the morning cleaning it up. And after everybody else had left, and the teacher, William Matthews, came up to him as he was trying to slink out of the door. And he said, "You coming next week, boy?" And his gruff tone sort of made Peter feel, I will go back. And he was planning not to ever set foot in that room again, but decided to go back. He became William Matthews' best student ever. And the rest was history after that. So I've got all these early bindings of his that he did at Guildford before he went to the Royal College of Art. This is a very soppy photograph. That was soon after we were married. We married in 1953 and we ran our own businesses of commissions and part-time teaching. But in 1957, we moved from working Surrey to Foxfield, Hampshire for Peter to become Roger's full partner. It was only 30 miles away, but Roger said he couldn't be a full partner until he was right there. So from college days, Peter and I collaborated on all our commissions, actively or with design critique, and I designed illustrations that were used on many of his and Roger's bindings. There's a selection of Peter's bindings now. That one, don't go on too fast. This one has onlays on it. The white is one piece of white leather, and the black is another piece of black leather stuck onto the white leather, and you can hardly feel the difference in height. They're prepared very thinly and stuck down and then tooled all the way around the edges and so forth. But that binding is primitive sculpture. The Beatles book, the black onlay is one thinly paired piece of leather. Very, very difficult to do, but there was a trick to it. He paired a piece of black leather very, very thinly and stuck onto the back of it, heat set, a piece of tracing paper. And I had to trace down the design of that was on the back of one of the Beatles in the book. So I had to trace the design down on the back of it in reverse, and then he cut it all out with a very sharp blades, and then peeled off the backing, and then he got this lacy bit of thin black leather to stick down onto a white binding. So that was the technique of that one. The other one is the Swiss watch. And there, if you look in the very middle of where the blind lines meet the gold lines, that's technically a very, very difficult thing to do, to make those lines all converge and still remain clean. This binding was for Chelmsford Cathedral. My drawings were made into separate zinc blocks and printed onto the leather binding after the book was bound. We developed this technique to a very high level of detail by the mid-1960s, but we've not seen many binders using the method since. We found we could actually print with especially hard drying printing ink. Very, very fine detail on actual leather.
So now to the Florence story. On Friday afternoon, November 25th, 1966, Peter was phoned by Howard Nixon, keeper of printed books at the British Museum. Nixon had been contacted by Dr. Casamassima, director of the BNCF, there he is, who needed advice on restoring more than 110,000 badly damaged rare 16th and 17th century printed volumes. These included 90,000 of the Palatina and Magliocchiana collections, a primary source for Western scholarship and the nucleus of the library. Howard Nixon knew Peter's work well. When Peter was only 21 and still in college, Nixon had commissioned him to design a bookbinding for the Livre Anglais exhibition in Paris in 1951. For this, Peter had revived the tradition of blind, pre-1500 blind stamped bindings, and Nixon had bought the book for the British Library's permanent collections.
Might add here though that this one in black is not the actual one. He bound it twice. The one that went in the exhibition and that's in the British Library was on a red native dyed Niger, and so all the blind work came out dark brown on that. But he bound this one for himself as a replica entirely in black, so you get the tactile feel of the blind stamping on that, but you don't get the contrast of colour. No, it's me, right? Nixon asked Peter to choose two colleagues and fly to Florence the very next day. I was actually in the bindery on that Friday afternoon when the phone call came through, and he was on a plane to Florence the next day with two people he asked right then to go with him. And one was Tony Keynes, who was a skilled private binder, and Dorothy Cumpstead, who was an expert teacher of binding, and they were able to drop everything to go with him.
Now, no one seems to know who this
Who this guy is, so he's anonymous.
He appears in quite a few photos.
I can't remember his name. He looks familiar, but I can't remember his name. Right. The three arrived in Florence complete with gumboots, without any clear mandate, and were set to work in the Forte di Belvedere to look for mould on dry books. There wasn't much mould anyway at that time in November. Books were arriving at the Forte by the truckload every day from grain and tobacco drying facilities in Italy. Well, they'd been sent by the truckloads anyway. Wet, muddied books had been dried en masse, and inevitably many had suffered further damage from the heat. In the Forte, working conditions were uncomfortable with no heat and little water, and students were busy scraping dried mud off books. Meanwhile, student volunteers were still digging books out of the BNCF basement, wiping off excess mud with wet sponges and scattering sawdust over them to absorb some water. In the 3 weeks after the flood, over 400 truckloads had already gone to drying plants. In the Zeffirelli film, we saw those students in the library. That, to me, was the most moving part. It just chokes me up every time I see them passing those muddy books hand to hand.
In his 1969 Penrose annual article, Peter describes the state of the dry books. So this is Peter writing. Despite good superficial cleaning before drying and the wise rule that the director at the beginning, that none of the books should be opened before arrival at the dryers, many of them arriving at the fort resembled abstract sculptural forms. Vellum and leather covers were distorted and shrunken. Book stacks in the library had characteristic openings at each end, and vellum bindings stored originally at the ends of the stacks had rotted where the water had run through these shapes, combining with the vellum to form a glutinous mass. Other covers were defaced with a combination of mud, sawdust, oil, mold, and edges were badly stuck with gelatin, mud, and sawdust. The books had been stood upright to dry in the heated dryers, allowing water and gelatin to drain. The concentration of gelatin was greatest at the openings between the sections, leaving them brittle. Covers that had been too hurriedly ripped off had dragged the sewing through the backs of the sections. The water, combined with excessive gluing of the spine when originally bound, had accelerated the damage to the backs of the sections. Early 16th century spines suffered least because they'd been pasted with starch paste rather than hide glue. As some of this is also shown in the film. The leaves of the book, bound in lemon vellum, withstood the flood better than most.
And this was a very important finding because it led to the later developments in non-adhesive and lymph vellum binding techniques. Only 4 days after the team's arrival, a high-level meeting showed that there was no plan at all for the future, beyond dry cleaning, wrapping, and storing the often very badly distorted books. And in that state, they'd be unusable by readers, maybe indefinitely. Peter questioned this policy and proposed an outrageous idea: to set up a colossal dry cleaning, pulling, washing, drying, and pressing plant to save and store the majority of the collections, wrapped but flat, to await mending and rebinding. The effect of this idea on Director Casamassima was dynamic, and from that moment he supported the team and the implementation of Peter's plan, no matter any opposition. In fact, he cut through enough red tape to warrant a prison sentence in normal times. It was decided that the whole series of operations would eventually be carried out in the BNCF itself. This decision marked a complete change of direction. The situation in the power station is an example of one of the innumerable challenges the team had to deal with.
On December 2nd, Peter wrote that during November in the power station with its plentiful supply of hot water, a German family had been directing 100 untrained but dedicated students around the clock in 8-hour shifts. They were washing large books, separating the leaves while wet, causing a lot more damage using a one-off technique achievable only by a highly skilled binder.
Peter and Dorothy, sorry, touch the wrong thing. We're reading off our iPad. Right, very high tech. Peter and Dorothy had monitored this operation for 40 hours straight, appalled at the damage that was being done. It took 24 hours to get the operation stopped and the German family returned home. After those 24 hours to get the operation, after those 40 hours, Peter went to his room at 11 p.m. to find 3 of my letters awaiting for him, brought by Roger Powell and his wife Rita, who'd arrived that day. At midnight, Peter was writing a reply, telling me about his experience, and that while reading my letters, he wept uncontrollably, relieving his tension for those grueling hours, and he felt terribly homesick. Over the months to follow, Peter's letters vividly described the day-to-day problems encountered in this evolving process. They expressed a whole range of emotions he felt about the successes with elation, the failures with depression, and the frustration over slowness and incompetence. He drove his team relentlessly, but they followed the demands of his vision, working long hours with little complaint.
On December 6th, in his 4th letter from Florence, there is another revealing paragraph about how Peter was feeling. And of course, there's a lot of intense feeling in so many of the letters in the book. It's kind of difficult for me to read some of it.
Especially where he's talking about, or I'm talking about your school records. His remarks.
A mediocre British school boy. Doesn't apply himself nor. Well, anyway, Peter in that letter wrote, "This experience has given me a tremendous shaking up. I hope you will notice a difference in me, for the better I mean, when I come back. It's the first time that I've had to take decisions, etc., on my own without Roger half in the background. And I shall not doubt, as I've always had secret fears, that I hadn't the confidence to carry things out like this."
The British were asked to take over and train the power station students in their new system of washing, not from the wet state, but after dried books had had their sections separated, or pulled, by the students who were dry cleaning and pulling books in the fort. Tony Keynes took charge at the fort, and Chris Clarkson joined the team to direct the power station students. The original briefing had called for one advisory visit to Florence by Peter, Tony and Dorothy, but from November through April, Peter stayed there for most of the time. At home, I became the liaison between binders and restorers going out to help and the British Italian Art and Archives Rescue Fund.
Peter goes on to describe the expansion of the team and the funding supplied. It became clear that a great deal of additional help was needed, and we appealed for more British restorers and binders, particularly those with teaching ability. In the following months, over 40 people worked for periods of about 2 weeks to several months, developing the system and training volunteers. The team included members of the British Museum Stationery Office Bindery and the most distinguished private restorers, binders, and teachers of binding in Britain.
I might point out, I'm in that
You can point to that.
second from left, that was me. I was there for 5 weeks in May and June.
You're one of many squinting at the hot sun.
Very brighter than here.
The flow of help was organised by Howard Nixon and supported by the British Italian Art and Archives Rescue Fund, whose major effort in Florence became concentrated on the BNCF. From time to time, the team was joined by restorers from many other countries. Guidance on chemical problems was given to the team by the British Museum Research Laboratory in collaboration with the Istituto di Patologia del Libro in Rome.
Peter then describes the preparations made from December through March for the move to the BNCF. Very early, it was clear that expert, careful selection for appropriate treatment would be needed for each book on its journey through the system. And at Peter's request, Roger Powell, then 70 years old, arrived in early December to concentrate on the skill work and to train more experts in selection, and Peter describes this process.
Before a book enters the restoration system, it has to be classified according to its value and the treatment it requires, and details of historical interest are recorded. Symbols were devised during our first week at the Forte to make international interpretation easier and designed to warn a student or worker of the state of the book and how it should be handled. For instance, OK indicated that a student could handle a book, whereas the International Road stop sign showed that it was particularly valuable and it should be reserved for specialist treatment. In the beginning, these signs were written on a slip of paper, but now a detailed printed restoration card and photographs of the original binding and any significant pages accompany each book with classification and directions for treatment. And we have those cards that Sheila did the calligraphy for, both in English and Italian. The card also indicates the history of the original structure by means of an enlarged symbol system with other relevant details.
He closes that paragraph with a very important sentence. These symbols guard against the temptation to make the system more important than the books that are fed into it. Let that one sink in. During the month of May 1967, while working with Peter, I designed these cards, drawing the symbols and hand lettering all the wording in plain, legible calligraphy, camera ready for printing by the thousands, one card in English and the other in Italian. But on his Sundays off, Peter photographed damaged books, his personal collection of slides finally numbering 1100. He insisted that every book should be photographed before treatment, and in less than 2 years, over 50,000 volumes were photographed to preserve their history. We're fortunate to be able to reproduce so many of Peter's original photographs in my book, Waters Rising, and to be able to show some of them here.
Next, in his article, Peter describes the actual procedures of treatment in the present tense. The first was cleaning and pulling. As much caked mud as possible is removed dry by flexing the edges of the leaves, and the remainder is flaked off with spatulas and sharp knives. The book is collated and the sections are separated by careful cutting of the sewing from the spine. Covers, headbands, cords, threads, fragments, and the record card, etc., are placed in envelopes and catalogued. The sections are prepared for washing by interleaving with wet-strength paper at frequent intervals. Hand-colored prints are protected where necessary with a 3% solution of soluble nylon in alcohol. Then came washing and drying. Each leaf is supported on a floating wooden board and washed individually by soft brushing in warm water containing a saturated solution of topane, which is 2-hydroxy-diphenol. This is followed by a gentle squeezing of the whole book, which is then pressed to remove excess liquid. Bleaching, deacidification, and resizing are done when necessary.
You can hear the words that were in the film.
Little reinforcement. At the power station, the washing had been done in rusty sinks covered with polyethylene sheeting. In the library, there were multiple stainless steel sink units totaling 40 compartments, and all water jacketed and thermostatically controlled. There's the sinks down there on the right, water jacketed sinks. Random pH measurements are being taken with a pi flathead electrode pH meter before and after washing. At the power station, sections were hung to dry on tearing lines, but in the library, they are laid flat on racked trolleys in purpose-made, electrically warmed, automatically controlled drying cabinets. A final collation is made by the librarian, and the book is then wrapped for storage. Oops.
Sandy Cockrell, who was an engineer as well as a well-known private binder and manuscript restorer, was the prime advisor in the design and fabricating of these large drying cabinets, trolleys and racks, and worked closely with Peter during several visits.
So Peter's article continues. Although the original intention was to send the prepared books to binderies throughout the world for mending and binding, by April 1967 it was apparent that this would be impractical. mainly because of the wide diversity of standards and the impossibility of maintaining proper controls. It was therefore decided that mending, the most time-consuming operation of all, should be done in the library, and that binding should follow. A mending department was designed for 30 workers, the maximum number for whom space and wages could be found, to be housed in the library's main reading room for at least a year or so. This was ready in August 1967, when the training of about 5 unskilled workers per week was undertaken until the room came into full operation. Mending methods had to be devised suitable for the scale of the operation and the condition of the paper. Long fibered Japanese tissue paper is used to form patches with adhesive designed to spread through to the area around the mend and remain flexible. A lens tissue is specially treated and used principally for the mending of tears. Many of the books have been reduced almost to single leaves, and on average every section has at least 2 folds needing repair. So this is making heat set tissue out of bath and using it.
When I worked in Florence for 5 weeks in late spring, Peter designed the mending stations and I drew plans and elevations for their construction. Each unit had a small light box inserted in the desktop and plenty of storage space on either side. In the summer we were in Florence for 9 weeks and I had the immense pleasure of watching the work desk being carried in and installed in the reading room. We left our youngest son Chris in the care of his grandmothers back in England, but we took Julian, then 10, and Michael, 7, with us. In that picture on the right, we're not in Florence, we're in Rome, as near as we were able to get to the Vatican, which proved to be impossible. We just drove around and around and around, and they were watching a Punch and Judy show. It's true.
And we're being watched by this lady over here.
Which was different from the Italians, obviously.
We're still working on the tan, I think.
The boys revelled in exploring the entire library and made special friends with the electrician, and they nicknamed him Sparks.
The final stage was rebinding, and Peter wrote, a bindery was started in September 1967. Many of the smaller books will be rebound in limp vellum. A study is being made of the early Italian limp vellum structures, as so many of the library's books are bound in this way. When a structure is sound, it is a long-lasting binding, strong and pleasant to handle, and fairly quick to make. A limp vellum style unique to the library is being evolved.
In the DVD film, which comes with Waters Rising, Chris Clarkson, who became recognised for his expertise on vellum structures, makes a limp vellum binding from start to finish. I think that was particularly impressive. You could even do one yourself just watching it, probably. Peter makes a leather binding. A print restoration department with on-the-spot chemical analysis was set up adjacent to the reading room by William Bastard, Chief Conservator in the National Art Gallery in Sydney, funded by the Australian government, and he trained a nucleus of workers in print restoration. It was later looked after by the chemist Jonah Krummer, who stayed for 7 years. After October 1967, Peter left the technical direction of the restoration system to Tony Keynes, the operation being funded for a further 3 years by the American Committee to Rescue Italian Art, which is CREA, and mostly back in England. Peter resumed working with Roger Powell, teaching part-time at the RCA, and joined as co-director with James Lewis in a 3-year program of backup research for the BNCF, overseen jointly by the Imperial College of Science and Technology and the RCA, funded by the American Council on Library Resources. In 1968, Peter and Roger Hill, then lecturer in filmmaking at the RCA, went to Florence to make the film about the restoration system, financed on a shoestring by the British Fund and intended to encourage more fundraising. There were only the 2 of them involved in the making of that film. And as an interesting aside, Roger Hill eventually gave up filmmaking, went to China, studied acupuncture, and became the leading, head of the British Acupuncture Association in Britain. And I wanted for the film to be accessioned by the Marriott Library and streamed. They had to have permission from Roger Hill. Well, I hadn't been in contact with him for years. He could have been dead for all I knew. So I Googled him. And of course he came up and found that he was a part-time lecturer on acupuncture at Exeter University. So I actually sent an email to whoever would read it in that department, and that very afternoon I had an email from Roger Hill himself. Now there's technology. If only they'd had that kind of technology in the Florence, after the Florence Club, things would have been a very great deal different and much easier. So the bookbinding sequences by Chris Clarkson and Peter were filmed at our home in Foxfield, England, and not in the library in Florence. And you see only their hands and arms and no faces, but Peter's are the hairy forearms and longer fingers.
In February 1969, Peter undertook a 12-lecture tour of the USA, armed with this film and slides, not exactly in this technology, but his original slides, speaking in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and then returned to New York, where Sheila joined him, staying with Carolyn Horton, before spending a week at the Library of Congress discussing his future appointment there. His lecture on February 17th, 1969 at the Morgan Library for the Guild of Bookworkers was arranged by Mary Schlosser, and 2 weeks later, Lawrence Majewski introduced him at the New York Conservation Center. Both lectures were taped, and transcripts were published by the Guild of Bookworkers Journal, Volume 7, Number 2, along with reports from Laura Young for New York, Paul Banks for Chicago, Margaret Leckie for LA, and Fraser Poole for the Library of Congress.
In her report, Laura Young described the Peter I knew so well. She wrote, "This was an assignment, the magnitude of which few handbook binders have been confronted with. He succeeded in putting together an organization composed of professional binders and volunteers from many parts of the world, whose work has ensured the successful salvaging of a large percentage of the more valuable items in the National Library. He could have come away a pompous know-it-all, and no one in the field would have questioned his authority. Instead, he came away grateful for the experience, humbled by the magnitude of the project, and keenly aware of the desirability, perhaps necessity, for a more serious approach both in the area of history of techniques and the scientific developments that are currently taking place. Aside from his personal charm, which we all enjoyed, and his vast knowledge, which we all respected, it was, I believe, his modesty that endeared him to his American audiences, the mark of a worthwhile man." I really appreciate that.
In Chicago, after his Caxton Club lecture, Peter was presented with a signed copy of Edward Cattish's new book, Origin of the Serif, with 3 pages of 96 signatures of members tipped in. During 1967, the student labor force of the BNCF was gradually replaced by about 100 Italian workers. The restoration estimated to take about 25 years, though it still continues today, 50 years later. The whole system was gradually moved to the basement rooms so the reading rooms could be reclaimed. Through the years, the workforce dwindled through lack of financial support. Now it's down to about 7 people in a lab outside the BNCF under the direction of Alessandro Sidoti. The dream of setting up an international training center at the BNCF never materialized because of insufficient funding and the lack of expert restorers available to continue training. Even so, the legacies of the BNCF experience gave impetus to the new profession of library conservation, with the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. leading the way.
At the Library of Congress, Peter was given the task of designing its large comprehensive department from scratch. From 1969 to 1971, he commuted from England 10 times to the Library of Congress until we permanently moved the family from England to America. And during the following 2 years, Peter was able to persuade the curators to think more broadly in terms of what Peter called phased conservation, now termed preventive conservation, instead of merely sending single items for repair to the library's bindery, as had always been done. Since then, conservation laboratories have been set up throughout the world, many of them directed and staffed by conservators trained at the Library of Congress and later at other centres too. Peter worked at the Library of Congress for 25 years, retiring in the mid-1990s. Tragedies and disasters often bring out the best in people involved, and the Great Florence flood certainly did that. So much good has come from its aftermath in the world of book and paper conservation, and all who laboured there will never forget the experience, and many of them have since taught and influenced countless others. Peter died in 2003 at only 73 from mesothelioma because of exposure to asbestos in his 20s. I wish he could have been here to talk with you himself. I want to explain what that really was. Mesothelioma is only caused by asbestos, and it's in the lining of the lung, not in the lung itself, and it can take from 30 to 50 years to actually come out. And we put it down to the fact that when he was in his 20s, he changed all the wooden handles of the tools that are used for striking in blind and gold on bindings to asbestos ones. It was the latest thing to do because then they wouldn't get charred when they were being heated up to do the tooling. And he changed all the handle letters of all the different sizes of alphabets and different styles of type and all the decorative tools and so on. He did that over about a 6-month period. There must have been literally hundreds of handles that he switched to these asbestos ones. And to make them more comfortable to hold, because they were like asbestos rods that were simply chopped off to equal length, he rounded the ends, because you'd hold the tool like this. He rounded the ends to make them more comfortable to hold on a lathe without a mask in a small room. And back in the 50s, the dangers of asbestos were not known by the general public, at least. And we really put that down to him doing that. And in the January of 2003, we thought he got flu, and by the end of February, he finally agreed to see a doctor. Typical of men, I'm afraid. They don't see doctors unless they can help him. And he didn't get a diagnosis until the end of April. And by the end of June, he died, because mesothelioma is very, very difficult to discover, and by the time it is, it's too late. And it's just a very, very nasty form of cancer. And it's ironic that it was his book binding that really caused that. Well, he brought the skills of a designer craftsman to the wider world of library conservation, and he used what he called sideways thinking to solve problems. This is the kind of thinking you learn in an art school, not normally in a library science, probably. He also felt that some treatments can cause more harm than good. But I feel honoured to have played a small part in this effort myself, and feel very gratified that we've been able to produce such a comprehensive record of events in the book Waters Rising. So by sharing these first-hand memories, I hope we've given you a feel for that momentous time after the flood, and how the Florence experience was so pivotal. Sorry. Now, any questions? Is there time for any questions? Right. Don't ask me conservation ones. I'm not conservative. I was only married to one. Yes.
Two.
Sheila, you had to run. Oh, excuse me. Thank you, Sheila. In your book, you mentioned how Peter urgently asked you to go run out and buy 50 of these tools for helping with the cutting of the threads and the pulling.
Oh, they were those little picker things that you can unpick seams with. They've got a little blade on the end of them. casino. I mean, like that. I couldn't find 50 anywhere, but I got as many as I could buy and got them for him. Oh, I was kept on the hop all the time, and having to do maths for Penguin Books at the same time, and have 3 little kids around, and it was pretty difficult. But,
we were also sent off to boarding school during the week.
only weekly book. Eventually that was so like, well, anyway, that's what we were.
So here's a question. Were all of the materials that were needed for the recovery of the books readily available, like the tissue and the adhesives and
I remember we drove over to Florence twice, full of contraband, covered over with blankets and things so that there wouldn't be notice on borders and so on. But we took over all sorts of stuff, even those nylon brushes that you saw the adhesive tissue being done with. And I think the paper was taken over from England, the actual lens tissue itself. So some things would have been available, of course, in Italy, but a lot was taken over by those who were going there. Right. Interesting question.
Thank you, it's very interesting. I have a question about the bindings. I don't recall seeing the films or your pictures. Were bindings restorable, not a priority? I'm just curious about what happened to bindings. It must have been beautiful in the restoration process.
Well, the damaged bindings?
Yes.
Well, I think some of the covers were in a condition to be able to be restored and put back on books, but not many because the leather would have rotted and it wouldn't have been suitable. So in the early days, with those students, for example, they were taking off the covers and putting them on lines and so on, but some could be used, but many could not.
But I think it's important to realise that a lot of these books being early printed books, the paper, of course, was very good. So the paper held up pretty well and stood up to washing and everything else. But, anything with animal products, covering the book was more susceptible.
Right. Well, the paper was handmade paper. Books printed before about 1840 were printed on handmade paper, not machine-made paper. And that was made from old shirts and cotton and stuff and so on. And could be washed, just like a shirt could. So that's why I think well over 90% of the books were saved of those collections. It was an extraordinary number. And I think if they had been left as they originally thought they would be, they would still be in their wrappers, probably sort of moldering away in the fort somewhere.
One thing that was noticeable, I remember a lot from when I was 10 in Florence, but going back 40 years later, we did 10 years ago, you see there's the river, and then, there's the library down there, and you can see if the things in the basement would have no chance. But weren't all those particular books put in the basement during the war to protect them, and then were never moved?
And they stayed there. They weren't brought up after the war. They remained in the basement, all their most valuable books. Didn't they think that they got a river right beside them? Florence was used to floods. The worst one, apart from the 1966 one, was back in 1333. But every 100 years or so, there would be a considerable flood in Florence. But nothing like as bad as the 1966 one.
Sheila, was this program funded by governments worldwide, or was this strictly funded by Italian government?
Sorry, can you get that closer because I can't understand.
Was the programs subsidized by only the Italian government or governments worldwide?
Which program?
The restoration.
Well, it was the Art and Archives Rescue Fund, the British fund that funded all the people and materials and so on that went to the National Library. Korea concentrated more on painting and sculpture and so on. The funds were coming mainly from Britain and America, but some other countries as well contributed. Rome was not very helpful, but then when you think of the history of Rome and Florence.
But you saw in the film, the Zeffirelli film, there's Ted Kennedy, and the Kennedys were very involved with fundraising.
Jackie Kennedy was the president of Korea. And at the symposium in Florence in 2006, on the final day, the keynote speaker was Edward Kennedy. Right, and we had the pleasure of shaking his hand at the luncheon afterwards. We were sitting on the table near to the door where he came in. It was under a marquee that was attached to the villa and so on. And he came in and we all stood up, you know. And he walked beside us and he said to the two of us, "Oh, I'm Edward Kennedy." I said, "No." And shook hands with us as we went by, finally to his table way over there. And then he gave a little talk, of course, at the end of the lunch as well. So the Kennedy family was very much concerned with the whole action of the Korea Fund. Right. Any more questions? What's the time? No, it's not that time.
Thank you for coming and talking to us. I just have one question. Did Peter ever talk to you about a particular book or set of books that he was very happy to have restored?
Can you get the mic nearer to you?
Sorry. Did Peter ever talk to you about a book or set of books that he was very happy to have restored while he was there in Florence?
Any particular book?
Yes.
No, he was too concerned with running the whole operation and running around seeing that everybody was doing what they were supposed to be doing and designing things and so on. He didn't do any actual restoration himself, only to be showing people what to do.
But I think that's kind of the whole point, because he was involved with, and they all were in developing systems for mass treatments, not just individual books. So obviously in terms of selection of what should be done first and so on, there were priorities, but it wasn't about the individual books, it was about, you know, how do we deal with this colossal amount.
Well, thank you very much. I don't have a question, but I was one of those students that helped clean books in July of 1967, and it was one of the proudest moments of my life then, and also the opportunity to learn really good Italian. But it was a fantastic experience, and I'm very proud to have done it.
Were you actually working in the fort?
In the Biblioteca Nazionale.
Oh, you were later.
So July 1967.
Right. It's brilliant. Who was in charge of the room then?
Was it any of those questions?
Wasn't George Kirkpatrick, was it? A British Prime?
I honestly don't
think he probably was by that time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that's interesting. There don't meet many people who are actually there. You must have been very young at the time.
Great.
All right, well, please let's give our speakers another round. And I hope you'll all join us for refreshments right outside. And as I mentioned, Sheila and Julian are also willing to sign copies of the book. There will be a few available for sale. Thank you.